It started with one plastic storage bin and a note that didn't have my name on it. The smell hit me before I even stepped inside. Damp cardboard. Old paint. Something chemical that didn't belong in a residential garage. I stood there with my hands still on the door handle, staring at a wall of boxes that hadn't been there the night before. My toolbox was buried. My workbench was gone, replaced by stacked containers labeled in someone else's handwriting, HOA property. I didn't need to guess who it was. Victoria Blake never asked, she declared. I found her note taped to one of the bins. Neat handwriting. Confident. Temporary storage for community use. Thank you for your cooperation. No signature. She didn't think she needed one. I could hear her voice in my head anyway, that calm, polished tone she used at meetings while she fined people for leaving trash cans out too long. I checked the lock. It was still intact, which meant she either had a key or had made one. Either way, she had crossed the line so casually it almost impressed me. I set my coffee down on the only clear inch of concrete and walked deeper inside. My boots crunched over something brittle, a broken piece of plastic. I nudged open one of the lids. Inside were old circuit boards, tangled wires, and dust thick enough to coat my fingers. Another box held paint cans, some of them leaking. The sharp scent burned the back of my throat. That's when I realized this wasn't just junk. This was liability, the kind that didn't disappear once you closed the door. I stepped back and looked at the garage again. It wasn't mine anymore. It was a storage facility. An unlicensed one. And somehow, on paper, it was going to be my problem. My phone buzzed with a message from the HOA portal. Violation notice. Improper use of residential space. Possible fines up to $5,000. I let out a slow breath and read it again. They had filled my garage, then fined me for it. That was Victoria's style. Create the problem, control the solution. I could have called her. I could have argued. I could have stood on her front lawn and demanded she clear this out. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up one of the labels and read it. Carefully. Inventory codes. Dates. Some of them recent, some not. Patterns started forming, the kind most people wouldn't notice, the kind I was trained to see. I pulled my phone out and started taking pictures. Every box. Every leak. Every label. I moved slowly, methodically, like I had all the time in the world. Because suddenly I did. Victoria thought she had taken my space. What she actually did was hand me something far more valuable. Evidence. And she had no idea what I was going to do with it. By noon, I had mapped every inch of that mess like it was a crime scene. Not because I was angry, but because I was curious. The labels told a story that Victoria never expected anyone to read. Dates didn't line up. Inventory codes repeated across different boxes. Materials were being stored that should never be kept in a residential structure. I stood there holding one of the leaking paint cans and realized something simple. This wasn't temporary storage. This was overflow. And overflow meant pressure somewhere else. I wiped my hands and stepped outside into the quiet suburban street. Perfect lawns. Identical mailboxes. The kind of place where people believed rules were protection, not weapons. My neighbor, Daniel, was watering his lawn. He glanced at my open garage and frowned. He saw the boxes. He saw the labels. He didn't say anything at first, then he shook his head. "She got you too," he said. That word stuck with me, too. I asked him how many others. He hesitated, then pointed down the street. 3 houses. Same story? Garages quietly taken over. No one wanted to push back. The fines came fast, the warnings came faster. And somehow, every complaint disappeared inside the HOA system. I thanked him and went back inside. I closed the garage door slowly. The light dimmed. The smell got stronger. And for the first time, I smiled. Because this was bigger than my garage, much bigger. I sat at my old workbench, now half buried, and opened my laptop. I didn't log into the HOA portal. I logged into something else. Something Victoria had never heard of. I typed in a few codes from the labels, cross-referencing them with public records, then with private databases. The results came back faster than I expected. My screen filled with entries, disposal contracts, vendor names, and expired, revoked, or ignored storage permits. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second, then I kept digging. Each box in my garage connected to a chain. That chain led to a company. That company led to a holding group. And that group had one familiar name buried in its filings: Blake Community Services. I leaned back and let that settle. Victoria wasn't just enforcing rules, she was moving assets. Quietly. Illegally. She was using private homes as unregistered storage to avoid fees that would have cost her company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. I looked around my garage again. Suddenly, it didn't feel like clutter anymore. It felt like leverage. My phone buzzed again with another notice. Final warning before penalty escalation. $5,000 could turn into 10. Then liens. Then legal action. They were tightening the timeline, forcing a reaction. I closed the notification without replying because reacting was exactly what they expected. What they didn't expect was patience. I stood up, walked to the garage door, placed my hand on the cold metal, and listened. The quiet hum of the neighborhood. The distant sound of a lawnmower. Everything looked normal. That was the illusion. I opened the door again and let the daylight pour in. Then I took one more photo, not of the boxes, but of the entire garage. A wide-angle shot, capturing every detail. Then I opened a different app. Not the HOA portal, not a complaint form, but a public listing platform. I stared at the blank title field for a moment, then typed slowly, "Free pickup." Everything must go. No questions asked? Available immediately. I hit publish, set my phone down, and turned off the garage light. Because I knew something Victoria didn't. When pressure builds long enough, it doesn't need force to break. It just needs an opening. I woke up at 5:30 the next morning to the sound of a truck idling outside my house. Not loud, just steady, like it had been there for a while. I didn't rush. I walked to the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar. Then I stood by the window and looked out. The first pickup was already backing into my driveway, an old Ford with faded red paint. 2 guys hopped out. They didn't knock, and they didn't hesitate. They saw the listing, they saw opportunity, and that was enough. I opened the garage door halfway, just enough for them to see inside. One of them let out a low whistle and asked if it was really all free. I nodded once. No explanation, no conditions. He smiled like he just won the lottery. Within minutes, they were loading boxes into the truck bed. Fast. Efficient. They were careful enough to avoid spills but not careful enough to question anything. I stepped back and watched. The smell of old paint and dust started to fade as the first layer disappeared, and the space beneath slowly came back into view. My workbench. My tools. My floor. Piece by piece. By 6:15, the red truck was gone, replaced by another, then another. Word spread faster than I expected. A van pulled up with a trailer attached. A man in a construction vest stepped out and started sorting through the remaining boxes like he was shopping. He picked the ones with copper wiring first, then the sealed containers. High value, easy resale. He never asked where it came from. No one did. That was the beauty of it. When something is labeled free, people stop asking questions. By 7 o'clock, the driveway looked like a rotating loading dock. Engines idling, doors slamming, boots on concrete. I kept the garage door half open, enough to control the flow, enough to keep it orderly. I didn't want chaos. I wanted efficiency. Every item that left was one less liability tied to my name, one less piece of evidence sitting in the wrong place. But I made sure to document everything. My phone stayed in my pocket recording. Not faces, not license plates, just movement, volume, and the steady disappearance of inventory that was never supposed to be there in the first place. Around 8:30, I heard a different sound. Not a truck but a car. A smooth engine coming to a clean stop. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Victoria stepped out in heels that were not meant for driveways. She froze the moment she saw the line of vehicles, the open garage, and the emptying space. Her eyes moved fast, counting, calculating, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then she saw me standing by the door. Calm. Still. She walked up quickly, her voice sharp but controlled, asking what I thought I was doing. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. I'm cleaning my garage. She stepped past me and looked inside. Her expression changed. Not anger, not yet, something closer to disbelief. She said this property didn't belong to me. I nodded and told her that was exactly the problem. A man carrying a box brushed past her on his way out, then another, then another. She turned back to me and raised her voice just enough for the others to hear, saying I was interfering with HOA assets, that there would be consequences, and that I had no idea what I had just started. I set my cup down on the edge of the workbench, which was finally visible again. Then I looked at her and said quietly, "You're right. This is only the beginning." Because what she still didn't understand was that none of this was random. Not the listing, not the timing, and not the people showing up at exactly the right moment. She thought she was watching her property disappear. What she was actually watching was the first crack in something much bigger than a garage. Victoria's composure didn't crack right away. She stepped aside as another man carried out a sealed container, her eyes following it like it was slipping through her fingers in slow motion. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. Her voice dropped to a lower tone, controlled, urgent. I couldn't hear the other side, but I didn't need to. I already knew who she was calling. Damage control always starts at the top. I leaned against the side of the garage and watched the last of the early crowd move through. By 9:30, the flow had slowed down. Most of the high-value items were gone, and the rest was scattered, less appealing, less profitable, but still moving. Victoria ended her call and turned back to me. This time, she didn't raise her voice, she spoke carefully. She said I had just caused significant financial exposure, claiming there were contracts involved, insurance policies, and agreements that I had violated. I let her finish, then asked one simple question. Do any of those contracts list my address? She paused, just for a second. That was all I needed, because that pause meant she knew the answer, and it wasn't the one she wanted. Another truck pulled up behind her. She turned as two men stepped out and headed straight for the garage. She tried to stop them, telling them the items weren't available, but they ignored her. They looked at me instead. I nodded once, and that was enough. They kept moving, and boxes disappeared past her again, one by one. She stepped back. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Control was slipping, and there was nothing in her system designed for that. I checked my phone. The listing had exploded, hundreds of views, dozens of messages. People were asking if anything was left, offering to come immediately. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need to, the system was already in motion. What mattered now was timing and documentation. I opened my email and sent a single message with no subject line, just attachments, photos, timestamps, and inventory codes. It was sent to 3 different addresses, one regulatory agency, one environmental compliance office, and one legal contact who had been waiting for something exactly like this. I didn't include any explanation, the data spoke for itself. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at Victoria again. She was pacing now. Small steps, tight circles. Thinking. Calculating losses. Trying to build a narrative that could still protect her. She stopped in front of me and said this wouldn't end here. I agreed. I told her it wouldn't. Because what she still didn't understand was that this was never about clearing a garage. It was about exposure. She frowned, not fully following, not yet. Then her phone rang again. She answered quickly, and this time, her expression changed faster. Her posture stiffened, and her eyes widened just enough to give it away. I watched her listen. Silent, no interruptions. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer controlled, it was tight. She asked them to repeat that, then turned away from me as if distance would change what she was hearing. It wouldn't. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that call. Because the moment those items left my garage, they didn't just disappear. They broke a chain of custody. They exposed storage violations. They triggered audits that had been delayed for months, maybe years. And now, all of it was landing at once. Not on me, on her. She lowered the phone slowly and looked back at the empty space behind me. My garage was almost clear now. Clean. Quiet. Mine again. But the real shift wasn't in the room. It was in her face. Because for the first time, Victoria Blake was not in control of the outcome. She was reacting to it. The last box left my garage at 10:12 in the morning. I remember the time because everything went quiet right after. No engines, no footsteps, just the faint echo of an empty space that finally belonged to me again. I stood there for a moment and let the silence settle. The smell was gone, the clutter was gone, but the weight of what had just happened was only starting to arrive. Victoria didn't leave. She stayed at the edge of the driveway with her phone in her hand, staring at the screen like it might change if she looked long enough. It didn't. Another call came in, and she answered faster this time. No hesitation. Her voice was sharper now, defensive. She started explaining, then stopped, listening again. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. I could almost hear the conversation without hearing a single word, questions she couldn't answer, numbers she couldn't justify, and locations that no longer existed. I walked back inside and picked up one of the last remaining labels that had fallen onto the floor. It had a code on it that matched a disposal permit I had already flagged earlier. Expired 6 months ago, yet still active in her system, still generating storage overflow that had to go somewhere. That somewhere had been my garage, and 3 others on this street. I set the label down on the clean surface of my workbench and opened my laptop again. Notifications were already coming in. Not from the listing, that part was done. These were different, automated alerts, compliance triggers. A flagged audit request has been received and acknowledged. Estimated review timeline expedited due to potential environmental risk. I read the line twice, then closed the screen. I didn't need to watch it happen in real time. I already knew the direction. Victoria ended her call and walked toward me again. Slower this time, more careful. She asked me what I had sent. Not what I had done, what I had sent. That told me everything. I told her the truth. I shared what was already there. Nothing more, nothing less. She shook her head and said I had no idea the scale of what I had triggered. I almost smiled at that because she was right about one thing, scale. But not in the way she meant. A black SUV turned onto the street and slowed down as it approached the house. No HOA logo, no neighborhood markings, just a clean vehicle with tinted windows. It parked 2 houses down. It didn't rush, it didn't signal, it just waited. Victoria saw it too, and her posture changed again. Not panic, something closer to recognition. She knew what that meant, she just didn't want to say it out loud. I leaned against the garage frame and folded my arms. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the driveway that had been full just an hour ago. Now, it looked like nothing had ever happened. That was the final piece, no visible trace, no physical inventory, just records. And records were harder to control once they left your system. Victoria stepped closer and lowered her voice. She said we could fix this, suggesting we could move things back, adjust reports, and reconcile inventory quietly and efficiently, like none of this ever happened. I looked at her for a long second before answering, then said something she wasn't expecting. This is already fixed. That was when the SUV door opened. 2 people stepped out. Not rushing, not aggressive, just deliberate. They started walking toward the house with a purpose that didn't need explanation. Victoria turned to look at them, then back at me. And in that moment, I could see it clearly, the shift was complete. She was no longer managing a situation, she was inside one. And there was no system left for her to control. They didn't show badges right away. They didn't need to, the way they walked said enough. Calm, direct, and focused on one destination, my driveway. Victoria stepped forward to meet them before they reached me, trying to regain control of the conversation before it even started. Her voice shifted again, polite, professional, the version she used in official meetings. She introduced herself before they asked, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding and that everything was already being resolved. One of them listened without interrupting while the other glanced past her into my garage, empty now, clean, exactly how it should have been from the start. When she finished, they asked a simple question. Has this address been used for storage under any registered permit? She hesitated. Not long, but long enough, before saying no. They nodded once, no reaction, just confirmation. Then they asked if she had any documentation showing authorized use of residential properties for overflow inventory. She started to answer, then stopped again, because the answer didn't exist. I watched the exchange from a few feet away, quiet and still, the same way I had watched everything unfold since morning. Victoria turned slightly toward me as if I might help her fill in the gap. I didn't move. I didn't speak. This wasn't my space to explain anymore. One of them took out a tablet and tapped through a series of files, cross-checking and matching codes. I recognized some of the numbers, the same ones from the labels in my garage, the same ones I had sent earlier. They were already connected, already verified. The system had moved faster than she expected, faster than most people ever see. The second person finally spoke again, asking her about Blake Community Services. This time, she didn't answer immediately. Her shoulders tightened, and her eyes dropped for just a second before she looked back up and confirmed her affiliation. That was the moment everything shifted again, not loudly or dramatically, just a quiet change in direction, the kind that doesn't reverse. They informed her that an immediate review had been initiated, that multiple storage violations had been flagged across several locations, and that all associated operations were now under investigation pending further compliance verification. The words were neutral and measured, but the impact was not. I could see it in her posture, in the way her hands no longer knew where to rest. She tried to respond, to explain, to frame it as a temporary solution or a logistical adjustment, but every sentence sounded smaller than the one before because none of it matched the records in front of them. One of them asked if there were additional properties being used in a similar manner. She didn't answer that question at all, she just stood there, silent. The neighborhood felt different now. Not because anything visible had changed. The houses were the same, the street was the same, but the illusion of control had cracked. And once that happens, people start to see things differently. Daniel was standing across the street again, hose still in his hand, water running onto the grass without direction. He was watching everything, not hiding it anymore. A few doors down, another neighbor stepped outside, then another, quiet observers, witnesses. Victoria noticed them too. That might have been the hardest part for her, not the officials, not the questions, but the audience. The people who had followed her rules without question were now watching her answer for them. The person with the tablet turned slightly toward me and asked if I was the homeowner. I said yes. He nodded and asked if I had voluntarily listed the items for removal. I said yes. He asked if I had been informed of any restrictions preventing me from doing so. I said no. That was all he needed. He made a note and stepped back. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, but something had changed. The certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, the realization that this was no longer a situation she could manage with warnings and fines. This was something bigger, and it was already moving without her. The questions didn't stop after that. They multiplied, quietly and efficiently. One of them stepped aside and made a call, not rushed, not urgent, just a continuation of a process that had already started before they arrived. Victoria tried to follow the conversation, tried to stay close enough to catch fragments, but she was no longer part of it. That line had already been crossed. I watched as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her confidence was still there, but it was thinner now, like something stretched too far. She turned back to me again, this time lowering her voice even more, saying this could still be contained, that if I cooperated, we could limit the damage. That word stood out, damage. Not misunderstanding, not mistake, damage. I looked past her toward the street. More vehicles had slowed down, not stopping, just observing. The kind of attention this neighborhood had never seen before. I asked her a simple question. How many properties have you used like mine? She didn't answer directly, claiming it was a temporary solution. I asked again, and this time, she gave a number, quiet and almost under her breath. 6. That was enough. 6 houses, 6 garages, 6 sets of records that now had to align with a system that had just been triggered. I nodded once and looked back at the officials. One of them returned and spoke to the other, short sentences, confirmations. Then they both turned toward Victoria again. They asked her to provide a full list of all locations currently being used for storage under her management. Not later, not by email, now. She hesitated again. That hesitation had become a pattern, a gap between what existed and what could be proven. She reached for her phone, then stopped, because she knew something I had already accounted for. The moment she provided that list, it wouldn't stay hers. It would expand, it would connect, and it would expose everything attached to it. I walked back into the garage and ran my hand along the clean surface of my workbench. Smooth, solid, mine again. The contrast was almost sharp enough to feel. Just hours ago, this space had been buried under someone else's problem. Now it was empty, reset. But the real shift wasn't physical, it was structural. I picked up my phone and opened a message that had come in a few minutes earlier, a confirmation from my legal contact. Review initiated. External counsel engaged. Estimated financial exposure under preliminary assessment. The number was not small, it wasn't even close. I locked the screen and stepped back outside. Victoria was still standing there, phone in her hand, frozen between options that all led to the same place. The officials were waiting, not pressuring, not pushing, just waiting. That was the part most people don't understand. When the system is real, it doesn't need to rush. It already knows where it's going. She finally started typing slowly, carefully, building the list they had asked for. Each entry was another thread pulled loose, each address another point of failure. I watched without saying a word because there was nothing left to say. The process had taken over, and once it does, it doesn't stop at the surface. It goes deeper, into contracts, into finances, and into liability structures that were never meant to be seen this way. Victoria finished typing and looked up. For a second, our eyes met, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about rules, it was about ownership, control, and scale, the things she thought she had, the things she never questioned. And the moment she handed that list over, all of it shifted out of her hands. Because what she still didn't know, what she had never even considered, was that the system she had been working around for years wasn't separate from me. It was connected. And now, it was finally looking back. The moment she handed over the list, the atmosphere changed again. It wasn't visible at first, it was procedural. One of the officials stepped back and entered the addresses into the system on his tablet. The screen responded immediately as cross-references appeared and flags populated one after another. 6 properties became 6 active nodes in a network that was no longer isolated. Victoria watched the screen like she was hoping it would slow down if she didn't blink. It didn't slow down, it accelerated. The second official made a call, short and direct. He used terms that shifted the situation from a review to enforcement coordination. That was when I noticed the second wave of vehicles arriving. Not neighbors this time, not observers, but marked units. A quiet presence, with no urgency in their movement because urgency was no longer necessary. The case was already forming itself. Victoria stepped closer to me again, but this time she didn't try to negotiate. She asked what I had done. Not what I reported, not what I submitted, what I had done. I looked at her and told her the truth had already been there. It was just not organized. That answer didn't comfort her. She shook her head slightly and said, "This was supposed to be a simple HOA matter." Her voice broke on the word simple, like it no longer made sense. I didn't respond immediately. I watched as one of the officials marked another entry on the tablet, then another. Each click represented a connection forming somewhere she could no longer interrupt. The street behind us had gone quiet in a different way now, not calm, but controlled. Even the earlier curiosity from neighbors had shifted into distance. People were no longer watching for entertainment. They were watching because they understood something important was happening, and they didn't know where they stood inside it. The official finally spoke again, confirming that the properties listed were tied to multiple compliance failures across storage regulations, environmental handling protocols, and unregistered use agreements. Each category he mentioned added weight without emotion. Victoria tried to respond again, claiming she could fix it, that it was administrative, or that it was a miscommunication between departments. But every sentence sounded like it belonged to a system that no longer existed. The second official interrupted her gently, stating the matter was no longer at the level of correction and had moved into an audit and enforcement scope. That phrase landed harder than anything else: audit and enforcement scope. It removed any possibility of a casual resolution. Victoria turned slightly toward me again, her expression different this time, not anger, not denial, but a calculation that had run out of options. She asked if I had coordinated this, if I had engineered the timing, or whether I had positioned the listing to trigger a chain reaction. I told her I didn't need to engineer anything. I only needed to reveal what was already structured incorrectly. That was when she looked down at her phone again. The screen lit up with messages she didn't read out loud. Her breathing changed slightly, controlled at first, then less so. I stepped back into the garage entrance and looked at the empty space again. Hours earlier, it had been overloaded with someone else's inventory. Now, it was a clean frame of concrete and air. But the real transformation wasn't here, it was everywhere else. The officials were now coordinating across multiple channels. The addresses were no longer just entries, they were evidence points in a larger system review. One of them asked for confirmation of the ownership structure related to Blake Community Services. That name now carried a different weight. Victoria didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, I saw it, the realization that the structure she relied on was being mapped in real time by people who already had access far beyond her control. I walked to the edge of the driveway again and looked down the street. More quiet vehicles had arrived without announcement, positioned at intervals that suggested coverage, not observation. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice lower now, saying this was going to destroy everything. I looked at her and said, "It's not destruction. It's alignment." Because for the first time, the system was no longer reacting to her decisions, it was correcting them. And in that correction, everything she had built around control was starting to disappear. The final shift didn't arrive with noise, it arrived with silence, the kind that follows after every system has finished checking its own assumptions. The officials stepped back from their tablets and exchanged a short confirmation. No celebration, no reaction, just completion. Victoria stood in the middle of my driveway like she was no longer sure where the boundary lines were. Her phone was still in her hand, but she wasn't using it anymore. It had become a useless object, disconnected from whatever she had been controlling before. One of the officials spoke first, stating that immediate containment procedures had been approved for all listed properties pending a full audit review. He used the word containment without emphasis, like it was routine, like it had already been decided long before today. Victoria finally asked what that meant in practical terms. No one answered immediately, and that delay said more than any explanation. I stood near the garage entrance and watched the space that had been empty for hours now feel heavier than when it was full. Because now it was no longer about storage, it was about structure, accountability, and systems being forced to reconcile with themselves. The second official finally responded, explaining that access to all listed properties would be temporarily restricted for both administrative and investigative purposes. He added that all operational activity tied to those addresses would be suspended until further notice. Victoria took a step back when she heard that. Not because of force, but because of understanding. Suspension meant she no longer had movement, no adjustments, no quiet corrections, and no internal calls that could smooth things over. I noticed her breathing change again, shorter now, controlled only by habit. She said my name for the first time without authority behind it, just confusion. I didn't respond immediately because there was nothing left to clarify. The system had already separated intent from outcome. One of the officials approached the edge of the driveway and placed a small marker on the ground near the curb. It was subtle, but it defined jurisdiction. Everything inside that invisible line was now documented, recorded, and under review. Everything outside it was no longer relevant to this case. Victoria followed his movement with her eyes, then looked back at me again. This time, her question wasn't about what I had done, it was about how far it would go. I told her it would go exactly as far as it needed to go to resolve the imbalance. That word made her pause, imbalance. Because it removed emotion from the situation entirely, turning everything into structure and correction. A third vehicle arrived and stopped without announcement. 2 more people stepped out carrying sealed folders, paper records. Physical documentation, the kind that only appears when digital systems are no longer sufficient. That detail alone told me the process had escalated beyond an initial review. One of them confirmed receipt of a cross-jurisdictional coordination request, while another confirmed a financial review initiation tied to associated entities. Victoria shook her head slightly as if trying to separate herself from the language being used around her, but there was no separation anymore. She had become part of the record, not the controller of it. I walked back into the garage one last time and looked at the cleared space. The concrete floor was visible in full now, clean lines, no obstructions, and no trace of what had been there in the morning. It felt like a reset, but not an emotional one, a procedural one. Outside, Victoria finally lowered her phone completely. She didn't drop it, she simply stopped using it. That moment was more significant than anything that had been said because it marked the end of her response cycle. The officials began to disperse slightly, each moving towards separate tasks, documentation, verification, and coordination. The process no longer needed presence in one place. It had already spread outward. Victoria stood still as the driveway emptied of immediate activity. She looked at the house, then at the garage, then finally at me. There was no threat left in her expression, no negotiation, only the recognition that the structure she had depended on was no longer aligned with her control. I stepped back into the garage and turned off the light. The space went dark for a moment, then reflected the daylight from outside in a softer way. That contrast felt final, not dramatic, just complete. And in that stillness, I understood something simple. The situation had never been about what was taken. It had always been about what was recorded. And once the record corrected itself, everything else followed without resistance.